So, we're going to dive into one of history's most terrifying and honestly most important questions. How on earth did the Nazi Party go from being a complete nobody to a force that caused such catastrophic destruction? This is the step by step story of how it all happened.
I mean, really think about this question. It seems impossible, doesn't it? A fringe political party getting barely 2% of the vote, and then just 5 years later, they have total control of a modern industrialized country? How does that happen? Well, to figure it out, we have to go all the way back to the beginning. All right, our story starts in the rubble and chaos of World War I. Germany was a defeated nation, completely destabilized and honestly on its knees. This set the stage for everything, and I mean everything, that came next. So the war ends in 1918, but that was far from the end of Germany's problems. The Allies occupied the Rhineland, which was basically Germany's industrial engine room. This was a devastating blow. It just completely choked the economy and led directly to a catastrophic economic crisis that exploded a few years later in 1923. Now, this crisis wasn't your typical recession. It was something else entirely, a phenomenon called hyperinflation. So what is that? Well, it means the country's money, the German mark, became worthless. I mean, literally worthless, almost overnight. People's life savings, the money in their bank accounts, it just vanished. And this right here captures the insanity of it all. This isn't some exaggeration for a fact. People were literally using wheelbarrows and laundry baskets full of cash just to go buy a loaf of bread. Can you even imagine the fear and the desperation? That kind of chaos creates a deep, simmering anger. Okay, so you've got this nationwide chaos and desperation. This kind of environment is the perfect breeding ground for political extremism. Because when people feel like they have nothing left to lose, they start looking for radical answers and for someone to blame. And right on cue, into this mess steps a tiny, almost completely unknown political group. In 1919, a young Adolf Hitler joined what was called the German Workers' Party. A year later, they rebranded themselves as the Nazi Party. But let's be clear, at this point, they were a total fringe movement, completely irrelevant. For a few years, Germany actually started to stabilize a bit. But then a global catastrophe hit. The Wall Street crash of 1929 kicked off the Great Depression, and the shockwaves slammed right back into Germany, plunging millions of people back into that same poverty and despair. And this chart? Wow. This chart tells you everything. You can see the direct line between economic disaster and the Nazis' political fortunes. In 1928, before the crash, they were a political joke, pulling in just over 2% of the vote. But by 1932, deep in the Depression, their support skyrocketed to 37%. Suddenly, they were the biggest party in Germany. The rise was just absolutely staggering. And this is the date. The date it all became horrifyingly real. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed chancellor. The established politicians thought, oh, we can control him. They thought they were being clever. They handed him the keys to the state. So, once they were in power, Hitler and the Nazi Party moved with a speed that was just breathtaking. Their goal wasn't to govern a democracy, it was to completely dismantle it and prepare for war. I mean, just look at how fast this all happened. Less than a month after Hitler becomes chancellor, the Fire Decree gets rid of basic civil rights like free speech. Less than a month after that, the Enabling Act effectively makes Hitler a legal dictator. He can now pass laws all by himself. In under 2 months, German democracy was completely dead. With total power at home, Hitler immediately started to push his luck on the world stage. First, he just pulls Germany out of the League of Nations, basically thumbing his nose at the international order. Then came a series of aggressive, calculated moves, reoccupying the Rhineland, annexing Austria. Each one was a violation of treaties, and he was just daring the other powers to stop him. And they didn't. And this was the final straw. The invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939, finally forced Britain and France to declare war. The world was now plunged into its second global conflict. The war brought the Nazi regime to the absolute peak of its power, at one point controlling most of Europe. But its own insane aggression would lead directly to its total and utter destruction. The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, that was the fatal mistake. It was a massive overreach that opened up a brutal, bloody second front that just bled the German war machine dry. 4 years later, it was all over. With Allied armies racing in from the west and the Soviets from the east, the regime collapsed. Hitler killed himself in his bunker, and a few days later, Germany surrendered. And even though the war ended in Europe in May, the conflict was still raging in the Pacific. It finally, truly came to an end with Japan's surrender in September 1945, closing the book on the deadliest war in human history. So, what are we supposed to take away from all this? Well, there are a few huge lessons here. First, economic desperation is like rocket fuel for political extremism. Second, democracy is fragile. It can be taken apart legally from the inside with terrifying speed. And finally, ignoring aggression doesn't make it go away. It usually just guarantees a much, much bigger fight down the road. And that brings us to the final thought here. They say history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. The exact events of the past aren't going to happen again in the same way. But the patterns of economic anxiety, of political division, the slow erosion of democratic rules, those are timeless. And the real question we have to ask ourselves is, where do we see those patterns rhyming today?